This video is a presentation and analysis of the concept of the eternal flame and fire more broadly as understood within a religious connotation in the classical period. If you like the idea of a series of videos dedicated to Bronze Age and Iron Age and classical religion, let me know in the comments. Enjoy.
Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is a Metatron speaking, and the concept of an eternal flame, sacred to the gods, that must be rekindled at all costs in order to continue to burn in perpetuity is found in all sorts of modern media, whether it be books, stories, video games and films. Think of, for instance, Dark Souls in the transition between the Age of the Ancients and the Age of Fire, where the first flame is a central element of the lore, the flame that gives rise to disparity. Think of the Elder Scrolls Oblivion, where there is something called the Dragon Fires in the Temple of the One, where fires that upon the death of each emperor must be lit anew by each new emperor. And there are so many other games and stories and novels that take advantage of this literary device. In fact, if you can think of any, let me know in the comments. But you know this channel, we always go deep into the rabbit hole of ancient history and civilization, and indeed, the concept of the eternal flame is as ancient as it gets. In ancient Roman religion, the sacred flame of Vesta was a sacred eternal flame that was kept burning in the temple of Vesta in the Roman Forum. The flame was guarded by the Vestal Virgins, who were priestesses of Vesta, the Roman goddess of the hearth, home and family. But let's rewind back further in time, in search for the origins of the myth. The sacral aspect of fire, or rather fire as a deified element, has its roots in the ancestral history of mankind. While Doomzil has proposed an Indo-European origin of the cultic nature of fire, starting from the Vedic deity Agni, who represents the protective and purifying fire which burns demons and acts as an intermediary between man and the gods, with its flame rising upwards to the sky, the deification of fire is actually present more or less incisively in all cultures of the ancient world. Fire as an element of celestial and divine origins, foreshadowed by the myth of Prometheus, connects itself and its origins to the sky with the initial concept of lightning. It is by learning to master fire that man manages a divine power, a potentially destructive entity that at the same time protects him from ferocious beasts, warms him, and illuminates the darkness. All of these characteristics led the fire of myth to shape itself around its protective and defensive elements at the expense of the destructive ones. In the minds of the ancients, a choice was made.
Hestia eudunatoi ocronu tugater basileia, mesonoi connecies purosai enao iomegistu.
The Greek deity to whom the flame was consecrated is
Hestia,
whose very name directly recalls the domestic hearth. Theoretically, the hearth of every private home was sacred to Hestia and was her manifestation, but every Greek polis or city also had a public place called
Prytaneon,
which was consecrated to Hestia and preserved her sacred fire, which was never to be extinguished and represented the spirit of the city. Originally, this was supposed to be some sort of royal residence, the seat of the
Prytanis.
And then, as time passes, its Prytaneum will end up acquiring even more representative functions in classical Greece. And in addition to being the meeting place of the most powerful magistrates and the place where the city's fire is kept, it becomes where foreign ambassadors are welcomed and where the most deserving citizens are hosted for some time at the state's expense. As a further proof of not only the religious importance of this fire, but also the political and civic function of it in connection with the cult of Hesta, is the fact that whenever new settlers and citizens were moved to found a new city, they would take part of this fire with them to symbolize the origin of a new common civic bond in the new settlements. The Greek figure of Hestia is strongly connected with the Roman Vesta. They're not exactly the same, but we can see there is a connection there. And it's no coincidence that Vesta has the epithet Iliaca for Ovid, meaning of Ilium, so of Troy. There is a strong mythological and literary connection to the sacred fire of the goddess of the hearth, thus Hestia of Troy, which Aeneas brings with him to Latium. It is however worthy of note the fact that anthropomorphic representations of these goddesses tend to be very rare, as in fact this goddess, in both traditions, has to be identified with the heart itself and its fire. However, if we dig deep into the origins and interpretations of the cult of Vesta in ancient Rome, we see that there are different opinions and traditions. For instance, while Ovid evidently attributes its introduction to Aeneas, Dionysius of Halicarnassus links the institution of the cult of the Vestal Virgins to Numa, the second king of Rome. Plutarch, for his part, seems to draw on very different and conflicting origin myths, referring on the one hand to Numa, but then writing that, open quotes, it is said that Romulus was the first to introduce the consecration of fire and appointed the sacred virgins, called Vestals, to preserve it. And still in Plutarch we read that there are also other traditions that say that Romulus himself was the son of a Vestal Virgin. Now we can clearly see why it would be interesting and even societally advantageous to connect the founder of Rome, the mythical founder of Rome, to one of the most important eternal ceremonies and traditions, the concept of Vesta. But it is also interesting to see why some people would prefer the concept of no, it was the second king Numa. The reason being that Numa, according to the myth, was a Sabine, husband of Tatia, daughter of the Sabine king Titus Statius. This could imply a Sabine origin of the cult, which is also suggested by Varro, but probably has its roots in a recurring topos in the Latin literature of origins, according to which the Sabines were a particularly pious people in contact with the gods. Archaeological and literary evidence in fact shows an archaic presence of the cult in purely Latin context, from Alba Longa to Tivoli to Aricia, Lanuvio and to Carsoli. And if a common origin with the cult of Hestia is probable, the cult of Vesta evidently develops autonomously, particularly with the figures of the Vestal Virgins, a purely female priesthood that is absent in the Greek context. A reality we could consider close, but at the same time very different from the cult of the sacred flame in the classical world, is the more ancient worship of fire in the Iranian world. Similarly to the cults of Hestia and Vesta, the veneration of fire within the Zoroastrian religion clearly has its origin in a cult of the domestic hearth. The hearth, providing warmth, light and comfort, was considered by the ancient Indo-Iranian people as the visible incarnation of the divinity Atar, to whom regular offerings were paid, according to a ritual that involved throwing the fat of a sacrificial animal into the fire, letting it melt completely, and thus feeding the flame and making it soar. The first literary reference and mention of this sort of ceremonial attitudes towards fire is mentioned by Strabo. As we read, Strabo reports that the Persians offered, open quotes, sacrifices to the fire by adding dry debarked wood and putting fat on top of it. Strabo also mentions specifically dedicated Persian temples in the region of Cappadocia, which were called fire temples, or piratheia, consisting of noteworthy sanctuaries with an altar in the center, on which there is a large quantity of embers, and where the Magi keep the fire always burning. Similar to the Greek and Roman worlds, the idea of fire as a representation of the state also seems to be present in the Indo-Iranian world. But since there was never a transition from the monarchical to the republican institution as there was in the classical period, the sacred flames seem to be inextricably linked to the figure of the monarch. And it is Isidore of Charax that specifically refers to the eternal flame, which was kept and fed in the city of Asag, unfortunately not yet identified, where Arsaces I, the king of the Parthians, was crowned. And in the letter of Tansar, a 6th century AD Sassanid document, there is explicit reference to the custom of dynastic fires, which burned perpetually as a manifestation of the authority and continuity of the reigning houses.
If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much.
But let's now go deeper and talk more about the Vestal Virgins, and in order to do that, the best author to read is in fact Dionysius of Halicarnassus. Let's read. The virgins who served the goddess were originally 4 and were chosen by the kings according to the principles established by Numa, but afterwards, from the multiplicity of the sacred rites they perform, their numbers was increased to 6, and has so remained down to our time. They live in the temple of the goddess, into which none who wish are hindered from entering in the daytime, whereas it is not lawful for any man to remain there at night. They were required to remain undefiled by marriage for the space of 30 years, devoting themselves to offering sacrifices and performing the other rites ordained by law. During the first 10 years, their duty was to learn their functions, in the second 10 to perform them, and during the remaining 10 to teach others. Just like the fire of Hestia was held in a specific building called the Prytaneion, the fire of Vesta was held in a specific building called Aedes Vestae. Looking further into the Zoroastrian religious environment, fire is not only an element of destruction or protection, but it is also an element of revelation, discovery. It is above all a revealing element linked to ordeals and the creation of the archangel Asha Vahishta, literally the supreme truth or justice, son of the counselor Ahura Mazda. And according to the teaching of Zoroaster, the offering made to the fire had to be performed with thought turned to the principle of truth. Hey, I really like that one particularly, and if you like this video, please consider subscribing, becoming a noble one, and clicking the notification bell. In Zoroastrian cosmogony, the fire created by Asha permeates all the other 6 creations of the other 6 archangels: men, animals, minerals, earth, water, and plants, giving them warmth and consequently the vital spark. The sacred fire of the supreme truth also manifests itself in many visible forms, from the greatest of all, the sun that orders day and night and controls the seasons, the domestic and ritual fires, and also the revealing fire of the judicial ordeal, prototype of the torrent of fire of the day of judgment. Due to his role of guardian of truth and justice, fire in the Persian context acquires a warrior connotation. And from reading Curtius Rufus, we learn that the embers of the sacred fire were drawn from the temples and carried as relics by the vanguard of the Persian armies that clashed with Alexander the Great. The cult of fire, with its multiple valences, was not only connected to the reigning houses, but to the state and the empire as a whole. As an ending to this video, I wish to read now the words of Alexander the Great as reported by Diodorus Siculus, which he spake at the death of Hephaestion. He ordered all the inhabitants of Asia should extinguish those fires that the Persians called sacred.